In the spring of 1881, a rancher named Thomas Brennan stood on the platform of the Cheyenne train station holding a photograph of a woman he had never met, waiting for a bride who had no idea she was walking into a carefully constructed lie. The other men, waiting for the afternoon train, thought Thomas was just another lonely cowboy who had sent east for a mail-order bride, another bachelor, willing to trade security for companionship in the hard country of Wyoming territory. But what none of them knew, what Thomas himself barely understood, was that he had fallen desperately in love with this woman months before she agreed to marry him, had learned every detail of her life through means she would never suspect, had orchestrated their entire courtship based on secrets he had stolen and lies he had carefully crafted to make himself appear to be exactly the kind of man she needed. The photograph in his trembling hand showed a woman named Eleanor Hayes, 23 years old, with dark hair and serious eyes that seemed to look right through the camera into some distant place of sorrow. Thomas had memorized every line of her face, had studied this image until he could close his eyes and see her perfectly in his mind, but what he saw in the photograph was not just a beautiful woman. He saw the shadow of desperation around her eyes, the tension in her carefully composed expression, the look of someone who was running from something terrible and hoping the frontier might be far enough away to finally be safe. What Thomas did not know, what would only be revealed when the train doors opened and Eleanor stepped onto the platform, was that the woman he had fallen in love with through stolen letters and carefully researched lies was also searching for him, though not for the reasons he imagined, and that their meeting would set in motion events that would leave one of them dead and the other transformed forever. Thomas Brennan had not always been a liar and a thief of other men's correspondence. 6 months earlier, he had been an honest rancher, lonely but content, making a living raising cattle on land he had bought, with money saved from 10 years of cowboy wages. His only vice had been drinking whiskey at the post office while waiting for mail. That rarely came, passing time with Samuel Porter, the postmaster, who had become his closest friend during the long Wyoming winters. It was Samuel who had first shown Thomas the letters, who had broken the sacred trust of his position because he was drunk and thought it would be funny to read aloud from the correspondence of fancy Eastern people to his cowboy friend. The letters Samuel chose that night were from a matrimonial agency in Boston, part of an exchange between a wealthy merchant named Charles Whitmore and a young woman seeking a marriage arrangement. Samuel had read them in a mocking voice, laughing at the formal language and the careful negotiations about dowries and expectations. But Thomas had not laughed. He had listened with growing fascination as the woman's letters revealed not a fortune hunter but a soul in quiet desperation, someone writing between the lines about fear and loss and a need to escape that she could never quite put into words. Her name was Eleanor Hayes, and she was the daughter of a Boston shipping clerk who had died, leaving debts that his daughter was expected to pay through marriage to his creditors' choosing. She wrote to Charles Whitmore with careful politeness, agreeing to his terms, accepting his offer of marriage and passage west. But Thomas heard in her words what the merchant apparently did not. He heard that Eleanor was not seeking love or even companionship. She was seeking escape from something specific and terrifying, something she never named, but that haunted every carefully composed sentence. When Samuel drunkenly suggested they read more of the correspondence, Thomas agreed with an eagerness that should have warned him he was crossing a line from which there would be no return. Over the next 2 months, Thomas made excuses to visit the post office whenever letters arrived for Charles. Whitmore and Samuel, who saw no harm in sharing the contents with his friend, read them aloud, while Thomas committed every word to memory. Through those stolen letters, Thomas learned that Eleanor's mother had died when she was 12, that she had essentially raised herself while her father drank away his grief and his salary. He learned that she loved poetry but had been forced to sell her books to pay for food, that she had worked as a seamstress until her eyes ached and her fingers bled, that she dreamed of open spaces and clean air and a life where she did not have to be afraid every time someone knocked on the door. He learned that Charles Whitmore was offering her security but not kindness, a business arrangement but not affection, and that Eleanor had accepted because she believed security was the best she could hope for in a world that had taught her not to expect gentleness or love. And somewhere in the reading of those letters, somewhere between learning about her childhood and her quiet courage and her determination to survive, Thomas Brennan fell completely and hopelessly in love with a woman he had never met. The realization drove him slightly mad. He began to imagine conversations with Eleanor, planning what he would say if they ever met, how he would make her smile, how he would show her that not all men were cruel or indifferent. But Thomas was not a wealthy merchant with fine manners and business connections. He was a rancher, barely making enough to survive, a man with calloused hands and rough speech, who had nothing to offer a Boston lady except honest work and a heart that had decided to love her without her knowledge or consent. The rational part of his mind told him to forget her, to stop listening to her letters, to let her marry Charles Whitmore and disappear into whatever future awaited her. But the irrational part, the part that had been lonely for so long it had forgotten what hope felt like, began to form a desperate plan. Thomas learned everything he could about Charles Whitmore through careful questions around Cheyenne. The merchant owned a dry goods store, had investments in mining operations, and planned to bring his mail-order bride to Wyoming to manage his household while he focused on expanding his business empire. Whitmore was a cold man, efficient and calculating, who spoke about his upcoming marriage the way other men spoke about purchasing livestock. He had never seen Eleanor, had chosen her from the matrimonial agency based entirely on her letters and her willingness to accept his terms. The wedding was to take place immediately upon her arrival, a quick ceremony followed by a business arrangement masquerading as a marriage. Thomas could not bear the thought of Eleanor trapped in such a loveless union, but he also could not simply steal another man's intended bride without consequence. So he did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He befriended Charles Whitmore, became a regular customer at his store, earned his trust through careful conversation and shared drinks, and when Whitmore mentioned needing to travel to Denver for business during the week Eleanor was scheduled to arrive, Thomas volunteered to meet her at the train station in his place, to escort her to a hotel where she could rest before the wedding. Whitmore agreed, grateful for the help, completely unaware that Thomas had carefully orchestrated the Denver trip by feeding false information about mining investments to Whitmore's business partners. Now Thomas stood on the platform with Eleanor's photograph and a guilty conscience, telling himself that he would simply meet her, verify that she was safe, and then step aside as honor demanded. But he knew he was lying to himself just as he had lied to everyone else. He had no intention of stepping aside. He had fallen in love with Eleanor Hayes through her stolen letters, and he was prepared to do whatever was necessary to save her from a loveless marriage, even if it meant destroying his friendship with Charles Whitmore and revealing himself as the thief and liar he had become. The train arrived in a cloud of steam and coal smoke, and Thomas watched as passengers began to disembark. He spotted Eleanor immediately, not just because her photograph was burned into his memory, but because she moved with the careful wariness of someone expecting danger. She wore a dark traveling dress and carried a single, worn carpetbag that suggested she owned very little in the world. Her eyes swept the platform, searching for Charles Whitmore based on the description he had sent, and Thomas saw the exact moment she spotted him holding her photograph. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and Thomas saw something flicker across her face that he could not quite interpret. It was not relief or happiness at seeing her intended husband's representative. It was something closer to recognition and fear. Thomas approached her with his hat in his hands, introducing himself as a friend of Charles Whitmore, explaining about the Denver trip and the hotel arrangements. Eleanor listened with an expression that gave away nothing, but Thomas noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped her carpet bag. He offered to carry it for her, and she refused with a politeness that felt like a wall between them. As they walked toward the hotel, Thomas tried to make conversation, asking about her journey and her first impressions of Wyoming, but Eleanor answered in careful monosyllables that revealed nothing. It was only when they reached the hotel and Thomas was preparing to leave her that she finally spoke more than a few words. She asked him if Charles Whitmore was a kind man, and the desperate hope in her voice when she asked it broke Thomas's heart into pieces. He could have lied, could have told her what she wanted to hear, but the words that came out of his mouth surprised him as much as they surprised her. He told her the truth. He said that Charles Whitmore was a successful businessman, but not a warm man, that he treated marriage as a transaction, that Eleanor would have security, but probably not happiness. He told her these things even though he knew it might drive her back to Boston, even though revealing Whitmore's nature served Thomas's own selfish interests. But Eleanor did not look shocked or dismayed by his honesty. Instead, she looked relieved, as if his truthfulness had confirmed something she needed to know. She thanked him for his honesty and asked him a question that changed everything. She asked him if he knew anywhere she could hide for a few days. Somewhere Charles Whitmore would not think to look for her, because she needed time to think before she committed to a marriage. She was no longer certain she wanted. Thomas should have refused, should have recognized that helping her hide from Whitmore would be a betrayal of friendship and honor. But the part of him that had fallen in love with Eleanor through stolen letters made the decision before his conscience could intervene. He told her about a line shack on his ranch, a small cabin 20 miles from Cheyenne where she could stay safely while she decided what to do. He offered this help with no conditions, no expectations, asking nothing in return, except the chance to prove that not all men in Wyoming were like Charles Whitmore. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, and Thomas had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing through every lie he had told, every secret he was keeping. But whatever she saw in his eyes must have convinced her he was sincere, because she agreed to go with him. They rode out to the ranch that same afternoon, and during the journey, Eleanor began to talk. She told Thomas about Boston, about her father's debts, about the men her father owed money to, and what they had threatened to do if she did not marry someone wealthy enough to settle the accounts. She told him about choosing Charles Whitmore from dozens of matrimonial advertisements because his letters suggested he would never love her, and she thought a loveless marriage might be easier than one where she had to pretend affection she could not feel. But she also told Thomas something else, something that made his blood run cold. She told him that 2 weeks before leaving Boston, one of her father's creditors had visited her, had told her that debts could be settled in ways other than marriage, had made suggestions that left bruises on her arms and terror in her heart. Eleanor had fled to Wyoming, not just seeking security, but seeking survival, running from a specific danger she feared might follow her even to the frontier. This revelation changed everything for Thomas. He had imagined himself as a romantic figure stealing a bride from an unworthy merchant, but Now he understood that Eleanor's situation was far more dangerous than he had realized. She was not just unhappy or seeking adventure. She was genuinely afraid, running from men who saw her as property to be claimed or destroyed. Thomas found himself telling Eleanor things he had not planned to reveal, offering her protection not just for a few days, but for as long as she needed it. He told her she could stay at the line shack indefinitely, that he would bring her supplies and make sure she was safe, that she did not have to marry anyone unless she truly wanted to. Over the next week, Thomas visited the line shack every day, bringing food and firewood and conversation. Eleanor slowly began to relax, to smile occasionally, to share more of herself than the carefully guarded letters Thomas had read in secret. He learned that she was funny in a dry, quiet way, that she knew the names of birds and plants, that she had a gift for describing ordinary things in ways that made them seem beautiful. And Thomas, who had fallen in love with words on paper, found himself falling even deeper in love with the actual woman who had written them. But he also began to feel the crushing weight of his deception. Eleanor trusted him because she believed he was an honest man, offering selfless help, but Thomas knew the truth. He had manipulated events to bring her here, had stolen her private thoughts through those letters, had inserted himself into her life based on knowledge he had no right to possess. The crisis came 10 days after Eleanor's arrival, when Charles Whitmore returned from Denver and discovered his intended bride had never checked into the hotel. Whitmore came to Thomas seeking help finding her, expressing worry that something terrible had happened. Thomas had to look his friend in the eye and lie, claiming he had left Eleanor safely at the hotel and had no idea where she might have gone. But Whitmore was not a fool. He had begun to suspect that Thomas's interest in his mail-order bride went beyond friendly assistance, and he hired men to watch Thomas's ranch to follow him and see where he went. 3 days later, those men discovered Eleanor at the line shack, and Whitmore arrived at Thomas's ranch with the law and a formal complaint of bride theft. Thomas could have fought the accusation, could have claimed Eleanor had come willingly, but doing so would require Eleanor to testify about her reasons for fleeing Boston, would expose her to questions about her father's debts and the men who had threatened her. Before he could decide what to do, Eleanor herself rode into the ranch yard and told the sheriff and Whitmore and everyone assembled that she had a confession to make. Thomas's heart stopped, certain she was about to reveal his deception, but what she said instead shocked him more than anything he could have imagined. Eleanor told them that she was not running from debts or creditors. She was running from a murder charge. The story she told was both terrible and simple. Her father's creditor, the man who had visited her and made threats, had returned a second time the night before she was scheduled to leave for Wyoming. He had forced his way into her room, had told her that he was claiming payment for her father's debts in the way he saw fit. Eleanor had fought him with a fireplace poker, had struck him when he tried to grab her, had not meant to kill him but had hit him hard enough that he fell and did not get up. She had fled Boston, not knowing if the man was alive or dead, had used the last of her money for a train ticket west, had hoped that marrying Charles Whitmore would make her disappear into a new identity before the law could catch up with her. But 2 days before arriving in Cheyenne, she had received a telegram at a stop in Nebraska. The man had died from his injuries, and Boston police had issued a warrant for her arrest. The silence that followed Eleanor's confession was profound. Charles Whitmore looked at her with disgust and announced that he had no intention of marrying a murderer, that their agreement was void. The sheriff looked uncertain, aware that he should probably arrest Eleanor, but also clearly sympathetic to a woman who had been defending herself from assault. And Thomas looked at Eleanor with a mixture of heartbreak and admiration, understanding finally why she had seemed so desperate, why she had trusted him so quickly, why she had asked him where she could hide. She had been preparing to run again, and Thomas's offer of the line shack had seemed like a temporary reprieve before the inevitable flight continued. Thomas made his decision in that moment of silence. He told the sheriff that Eleanor had acted in self-defense, that any reasonable person would have fought off an attacker, that charging her with murder for protecting herself was a miscarriage of justice. He offered to pay for lawyers, to testify on her behalf, to do whatever was necessary to make sure she received a fair hearing. But Eleanor stopped him with a hand on his arm and a sad smile. She told him she could not ask him to ruin himself for a woman he barely knew, could not let him sacrifice his reputation and resources for a lost cause. She told the sheriff she would return to Boston voluntarily to face trial, that she would not run anymore, because running had only made everything worse. Thomas felt something break inside him at those words, felt all his carefully constructed plans and desperate hopes crumble to dust. But he also felt something else, something he had not experienced since before the war. He felt the clarity that comes from knowing exactly what matters and what does not. He told Eleanor that she was not a woman he barely knew. He told her, in front of the sheriff and Charles Whitmore and his own ranch hands, that he had been reading her letters for months, that he had fallen in love with her through stolen words, that he had orchestrated their meeting through lies and manipulation. He confessed everything, holding nothing back, accepting that his admission would destroy any chance he had with her, but unable to let her believe he was better than he was. The look on Eleanor's face as he spoke passed through shock and anger and hurt before finally settling on something that might have been understanding. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she told him her own secret. She said that she had known who he was the moment she saw him on the train platform. Her friend, who worked at the matrimonial agency in Boston, had written to warn her that a postmaster in Cheyenne had been indiscreet with her correspondence, that her letters had been shared with a local rancher. Eleanor had arrived in Wyoming knowing that Thomas Brennan had read her private thoughts, had been prepared to confront him about the violation, had initially planned to use his guilt to convince him to help her hide. But then she had spent a week talking with him, had seen his genuine kindness beneath the deception, had found herself caring for him, despite the lies that had brought them together. They stood staring at each other in the dusty ranch yard, two people who had built a relationship on stolen letters and desperate deceptions, both guilty of using the other, both surprised to discover that somewhere in the midst of the lies, real feeling had taken root. The sheriff cleared his throat and asked Eleanor again if she intended to return to Boston for trial. Eleanor looked at Thomas, and Thomas looked back, and something passed between them that needed no words. She told the sheriff she would return, but she asked for 2 weeks to settle her affairs in Wyoming first. The sheriff, who was a romantic beneath his gruff exterior, agreed. Those 2 weeks became the most honest time of Thomas's life. He and Eleanor talked every day, sharing the truths they had hidden, discussing the future that might or might not exist beyond her trial. Thomas contacted lawyers in Boston, arranged for the best criminal defense his savings could buy, sent affidavits from Wyoming citizens, attesting to Eleanor's character. Eleanor, for her part, stopped running in her mind. She accepted what was coming, prepared herself for trial, but she also allowed herself to imagine a different ending. She and Thomas made no promises to each other, spoke no words of love, but they worked side by side on his ranch, and in the quiet moments between chores and conversation, they built something that felt more real than anything either of them had known before. When the 2 weeks ended, Thomas accompanied Eleanor on the train back to Boston. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution painted Eleanor as a dangerous woman who had murdered a respectable businessman over money. The defense presented evidence of the man's character, testimony from neighbors who had heard him threaten Eleanor, medical evidence showing the bruises on her arms. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a verdict of self-defense. Eleanor Hayes was free. They returned to Wyoming 3 weeks later, and this time when Eleanor stepped off the train in Cheyenne, she was not running from anything. She was choosing a future, choosing a place, choosing a man who had loved her through stolen letters and then learned to love her more through honest truth. They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at Thomas's ranch, and neither of them ever spoke again about the lies that had brought them together. Instead, they spoke about the truth they had built from the ruins of those lies, about the love that had survived deception and danger to become something worth keeping. Years later, when their children asked how they had met, Eleanor and Thomas would smile at each other with the secret understanding of people who had walked through fire together. They would tell their children about letters and trains and a meeting at a station, but they would leave out the stolen correspondence and the manipulation. Not because they were ashamed, but because they understood that some stories are too complicated for simple telling, that some love begins in darkness before it finds the light. What mattered was not how they had started, but what they had built together. A ranch that prospered, a family that grew, a love that had been tested by lies and truth alike and had emerged stronger than either of them had dared to hope. Thomas had loved Eleanor before she ever arrived, had fallen for words on paper, and constructed a fantasy that nearly destroyed them both. But the real Eleanor, the woman who had survived assault and murder charges in a loveless engagement, had taught him that love built on truth was worth more than 1,000 stolen letters. And together, they had written a different story, one where two imperfect people found redemption in honesty and grace and second chances, proving that even the most tangled beginning can lead to an ending worth the journey.